All right, diving in again. This time, we're taking a look at this stack of research all about applied behavior analysis.
ABA.
ABA, exactly. Some people, when they hear behavior analysis, it can sound a bit intimidating.
It does sound very clinical.
Yeah. So maybe a good way to think about it is like we're detectives,
Oh,
like
I like that.
trying to figure out the why
Yeah.
behind people's actions.
Absolutely.
And we've got all these clues in this research to help us crack the case.
The best part is this isn't just some theoretical stuff. This is practical knowledge you can use every day.
Love it. Well, let's start with the basics. Behavioral assessment. What is that?
Behavioral assessment, that's our detective toolkit. We're gathering information about a behavior, what it looks like, how often it happens, what's triggering it, all of that.
Okay.
Like, imagine a supervisor's noticing that some employees are always late, but it's always on Mondays. So instead of jumping to conclusions, they could, start actually tracking those arrival times.
Ah, interesting. So like gathering clues before you jump to conclusions.
Exactly. And this assessment, it isn't a one-time thing either. It happens before, during, and after you put anything in place.
Right.
Like, helps us decide if we even need to do anything, what's the best approach, and if what we're doing is working or not. It's not like a one-size-fits-all thing.
So it's like consistently checking the map, making sure you're on the right track.
Exactly.
Now, I see here there are two types of assessment, direct and indirect. Now, is this where our detective analogy comes back in?
Oh, it totally does. Direct assessment is like you're witnessing a crime, you're seeing it right there in front of you. That's direct observation. It gives us the most accurate info, of course.
Front row seats to the action.
Yeah.
No relying on like he said, she said kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then there's indirect assessment, more like gathering witness statements, right? We're looking at interviews, questionnaires, that sort of thing to try to piece together what happened.
So indirect is good for when you can't directly see the behavior.
Right, like if it doesn't happen that often or if it only happens when nobody's around.
Makes sense. But just like with witness statements, they can be unreliable sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Memories can be fuzzy. People might misinterpret things. So direct observation is generally the way to go if you can. It's considered the most accurate.
All right. So one thing that really stood out to me in this research is this idea of defining the target behavior super specifically.
Yeah.
Like, why is that so important?
Well, because we need to be clear. Everyone needs to be on the same page about what we're talking about. We can't just rely on vague labels like, oh, they have a bad attitude or they're throwing a tantrum.
Right. Like in recipes when they say add a pinch of salt, what does that even mean? My pinch and your pinch might be totally different.
Exactly. In ABA, we like to be precise, very specific. So instead of tantrum, we'd say they're screaming, they're kicking their feet, throwing toys, that sort of thing.
Ah, I see. So it's like instead of saying go north, you're giving someone exact GPS coordinates.
Exactly. And that level of detail is important so you can measure things correctly, get consistent results.
That makes a lot of sense. Actually, there's a really interesting example in the research about how specific they get when they study self-injurious behaviors. They don't just say self-harm, right?
No.
It's like arm biting, face hitting, head banging, with all these detailed descriptions for each.
Yeah.
Which I guess makes sense if you want to like accurately track what's going on.
Exactly. That's the precision that makes ABA so powerful. It lets us really understand and change behavior.
So once we've defined the target behavior, I guess the next step is figuring out how to track it, right? How do we actually observe what's going on?
That brings us to recording methods.
Recording methods. Okay, so this is where we put on our like evidence gathering hats.
You got it. And just like a detective has all sorts of tools, we've got different ways to record behavior.
Okay, so let's break those down. What's the first one?
So first, we've got continuous recording. That's literally what it sounds like. We're tracking every single instance of the behavior. It's the most thorough, but it can be very time-consuming.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So if, like, I wanted to track how many times I check my phone in a day, that'd be continuous recording.
Exactly. You'd be marking down every single time you pick up your phone and look at it.
That's a lot. Okay. Now, what about the other ways to record behavior?
Well, we also have product recording.
Product recording. Does that have something to do with, like, measuring the outcome of a behavior, like the end result?
Exactly. We're not actually observing the behavior as it happens, but looking at the tangible result.
So, like, instead of watching someone work, you might count how many units they assembled.
Perfect example. Or a teacher might look at a completed homework assignment to see how much a student learned.
That sounds pretty convenient.
It is, but there's a catch. You don't always know who did the behavior. If someone turns in a perfect assignment, you don't know for sure they actually did it themselves, right?
That's true. Okay, so we've got continuous recording and product recording. What else is there?
Well, sometimes we don't need to be watching all the time. We can use something called interval recording.
Interval recording, so like just checking in at certain intervals.
Exactly. We divide the observation period into smaller chunks, like maybe 10 seconds each, and then we note whether the behavior happened in each of those intervals.
So instead of watching a whole hour, I might break it down into 10-second chunks and just see if the behavior happened during each one.
That's it. And this gives us a percentage of intervals with the behavior, which can tell us a lot.
Ah, okay. That does sound a lot more manageable than watching nonstop. Now, I remember seeing something about time sample recording, too.
Right. Time sample recording is similar to interval recording, but instead of observing continuously throughout the interval, we're just looking at a specific moment.
So, like, instead of watching the whole 10 seconds, I might just look at the very end of the interval and see if the behavior is happening at that exact moment.
Exactly. It's like taking a snapshot. It's really helpful when we can't devote all our attention to observing.
Wow, this is making me realize how much goes into observing behavior. It's not just about casually watching. There's a whole science to it. Now, there's one more concept I want to ask you about.
Okay.
It's this idea of reactivity.
Yes. Reactivity. Have you ever noticed how people act differently when they know someone's watching them?
Oh, all the time. Like, you suddenly become super aware of how you're sitting when you realize someone's behind you.
Exactly. The very act of observing can change behavior, and this can be tricky in research. It can mess with our results.
Right. So is there any way to, like, get around that?
There are ways to minimize it, like we can let the person get used to being observed or use less obvious methods like video recording. But here's a cool thing. Sometimes reactivity can actually be helpful.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, think about self-monitoring. Have you ever noticed that just by tracking something, like how much you spend or how many calories you eat, you actually start to change that behavior?
Oh, that's true.
Right. It's just by paying attention that we can make a difference. And that's because self-monitoring brings a level of awareness that can be really powerful.
My mind is blown. We've covered so much, from defining behavior to choosing a recording method to understanding how our observation can actually change things. I'm starting to feel like a real behavior detective.
Me too. But there's one more key concept we need to cover. It's called Inter-Observer Agreement, or IOA for short.
Inter-observer agreement. What's that all about?
Well, it's all about making sure our observations are reliable. Like, imagine two detectives are watching the same scene. How do we know they're seeing and recording the same things?
Right.
That's where IOA comes in.
So it's like a check to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. We have two observers independently record the behavior and then compare their data. And if there's a high percentage of agreement, usually like 80% or higher, we know things are consistent and we can trust our observations.
That makes total sense. You wouldn't want your data to be based on just one person's interpretation.
Right.
Right. You want to make sure everyone's seeing the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
IOA is really important for making sure our observations in ABA are solid and reliable. So you're probably wondering how this inter-observer agreement thing actually works in practice.
Oh, I was just thinking that. Like, it seems easy enough when you're just counting how many times a behavior happens.
Right.
But what about those other methods where you're breaking the observation into intervals? How do you make sure everyone's on the same page then?
It's a good question. Okay, so let's imagine we're using that interval recording to track, say, a child's on-task behavior in a classroom.
Okay.
We have two observers, and they each have their data sheets all divided up into those little intervals, like 10 seconds each.
Got it.
And they're both watching the same child at the same time, both marking down what they see on their sheets.
Independently.
Yep. And then afterward, we compare what they recorded, interval by interval.
Okay.
Each time they agree whether they both saw the behavior or they both agreed it didn't happen, that counts as an agreement.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not just about agreeing when the behavior happened. It's about agreeing on the whole picture.
Exactly. Agreement on whether the behavior was there or not there in each little time chunk.
Oh, God.
And then we just calculate the percentage of agreement. So if they agreed on, let's say, 18 out of 20 intervals, that's a 90% IOA, pretty good. That means they're observing pretty reliably.
This whole IOA thing is making me think about how we interpret information in general, like in everyday life.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're constantly flooded with data and news stories and opinions.
Right.
How do we know what to trust?
Yeah.
It's like we all need our own inter-observer agreement to filter through all that.
Oh, I love that. You're totally right. Being able to think critically, question your sources, look for consistency, consider different perspectives. That's so important these days.
Yeah.
Especially with so much information flying around.
It's like our own internal BS detector.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this whole foundation of behavioral assessment, these tools for recording what we're seeing. But I know ABA is more than just collecting data, right? It's about using it to actually help people.
Exactly. That's where the real magic happens. The information we gather through assessment and observation, that's our guide for developing interventions that actually work.
Okay, so the interventions are all about making a positive change.
Right, but not about like fixing people or forcing them into some mold.
Right.
It's about really understanding their behavior and helping them reach their goals, whatever those might be.
So, like, if a child's struggling with social interaction, instead of just saying, oh, they're shy, you'd observe what's actually happening and tailor your approach to that.
Exactly. We might observe that their anxiety really spikes in large groups, for example. That would give us a starting point for developing a plan, maybe strategies to help them gradually build their confidence in social situations.
I see. So it's really personalized,
Yeah.
not just a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. No two people are exactly alike, and their needs and challenges are going to be different.
So we're starting to see the big picture here. Assessment to understand the behavior, recording methods to track it, then interventions to create positive change. But I got to be honest, I'm still a little fuzzy on what those interventions actually look like.
Well, it's a big field. But essentially, ABA interventions are all based on the principles of learning and reinforcement.
Okay, so this is where we get into things like positive reinforcement, like giving rewards.
You got it. Think about potty training. You celebrate those little successes, right? You cheer, you give stickers. That's positive reinforcement. You're making that behavior more likely to happen again.
Oh yeah, that's a classic. But I'm guessing in ABA, reinforcement can be a lot more sophisticated than just stickers.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's all about figuring out what actually motivates each individual, what they find rewarding, and what kinds of consequences actually work to shape their behavior. It's all about customizing the approach.
This is making me think about that famous quote by B.F. Skinner. Education is what survives when what has been learned has been forgotten. It seems like ABA is all about creating lasting change through understanding those core principles of how we learn.
That's a great connection. Skinner's work was really foundational to ABA, and his idea of understanding how the environment shapes behavior is still super important.
So it's not just about the person in isolation.
Right.
It's about looking at the whole context.
Exactly. Their environment, their relationships, all the factors that might be influencing their behavior.
It really is a holistic approach. We're seeing that human behavior is complex, influenced by so many things.
Right. It's not simple.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer to any of this.
Okay, so we've got this whole framework of assessment, observation, learning principles, all aimed at creating positive change.
Right.
But I do have to ask, are there times when ABA is misused or applied in a way that's not helpful?
That's a really important question. Like any powerful tool, ABA can definitely be misused if it's not done ethically and responsibly. One concern is that interventions could become too controlling or coercive.
Yeah, I can see how that could happen if it's more about making someone comply rather than understanding their needs.
Exactly. Ethical ABA practice is always about empowering the individual, not controlling them. And another potential pitfall is trying to use ABA in situations where it's just not appropriate or effective.
So it's not a magic solution for every single problem.
Right. It's important to recognize that ABA has its limitations and to use it wisely and always with the individual's well-being in mind.
That makes sense. So the ethical part is just as important as the techniques themselves.
Absolutely. ABA is about using our knowledge of behavior to improve lives. And that means always acting with integrity and compassion.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. We've gone from the nuts and bolts of how to record behavior all the way to the big picture ethics of ABA.
Right.
It's really incredible how much depth there is to all of this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field. I hope this has inspired our listeners to explore more.
I think so. And I think we've given everyone a lot to process. We've covered so much. Maybe before we wrap things up, we should give everyone a moment to digest all this information.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's a lot to take in. But hopefully it sparks some curiosity about ABA and what it can do.
I know my brain is definitely buzzing. So before we say goodbye, any last words of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
You know, one thing that always gets me about ABA is just how connected it all is.
Yeah.
We talked about assessment, observation, the recording methods, interventions, the ethics. It's all woven together, you know?
It's a whole system.
It is. It's a whole way of looking at things, understanding them.
And the more you learn about it, the more you can apply that framework to different areas of life.
Exactly. I mean, it's not just for, like, therapists and teachers. It's relevant to anyone who works with people, really.
Oh, absolutely. Like even in business or parenting or just personal growth.
Oh, yeah, all of that. Once you start seeing things through that ABA lens, it really opens up your perspective.
So if there's one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with from this deep dive, what would it be?
Well, if I had to pick just one, it would be this. Behavior isn't random. There are reasons behind everything we do.
Right.
And it's a combination of things inside us and in the world around us. But the cool thing is, once you understand those factors, you can start to make changes, positive changes.
It's empowering. Right. It's like we're not just stuck with the way things are.
Exactly. We can learn, we can grow, we can create environments that support that growth for ourselves and others.
Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. We've learned so much about how to observe behavior, how to measure it, how to use that knowledge to make a real difference.
It's been a fun journey.
It really has. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. I always love getting to talk about this stuff.
And to all our amazing listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of ABA. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even inspiring.
Yeah. Keep those minds curious, and remember, there's always more to learn.
Absolutely. Happy analyzing, everyone.